In my quest to fix the oil leaks on risky business, our 1985 Porsche 928S, I had to remove 5 key components to gain access. First was the starter, then was the complete steering rack, the engine cross member, the sway bar, and of course the engine mounts. One thing I did not plan on was the fact that the engine mounts would likely need to be replaced. And sure enough, as I started removing components, it was clear, compared to new units, that the engine mounts had to be done, and now was the time to do it. While this is not a complicated process, it's very involved with a lot of alignment and some things you have to think of ahead of time. So hopefully the detail I've provided in here will help you save a lot of time if you have to do this job yourself. Stay tuned. So if you've been following along on the project, the last video, I cleaned up the oil pan, what was a very leaky oil pan, put a new oil pan gasket in. So now starts the process of putting all of the 5 components I mentioned earlier back in. With the engine cross member and engine mounts out, I was a little bit squirrely about having the car supported from just 2 bar stands from the top of the engine. And so I was using my pole jack from the bottom to keep the car supported. My freakish fear of the engine falling out prevented me from being able to move the car up or down on the lift. It also precluded being able to store 3 cars in the garage till I got that done. So with that being a critical motivating factor, I set out to get the engine mounts and cross member back in as soon as possible. First step was taking apart and removing the old engine mounts. So given the cold weather, I went down to my basement workshop, and using my Dremel tool, I was cleaning up the surface rust on that's the bottom plate of the engine mount on by my Dremel tool, and then this is the actual U-shaped engine mount. What you see in that is the old mount. And kind of in the background there, you see the new one. There I'm showing the mounts and putting some liquid wrench on, and I thought I would have the bright idea of trying to remove these while they were fixed on the cross member itself. But being a rubber bushing, they were just too compliant, so that wasn't going to work. That required putting now you see me using my big breaker bar, the U-shaped mounts mounted in the vise, and that allowed me to get the old mounts out. And here I am taking I believe it's the driver's side one out. If you're new to these videos, my goal with this car is to make it a solid driver. It doesn't have the documentation to be a Concours Queen. So with the engine mounts being hidden away down into the recesses of the engine bay, I just wanted to clean them up and prevent any rust from damaging in the future. An old restorer's trick is to use what's known as Pour 15 paint, and I always have a quart of it around, as you can see. And here I am just brushing on. You just remove the surface rust, clean up any oil or grease, and this stuff goes on pretty thick. You're basically sacrificing a paintbrush to use it. You put 2 coats on. I put a little bit on the cross member where there was some surface rust. Great product I've used for many years. Once I let the Pour 15 dry for a day or 2, came back downstairs and thought I'd have the bright idea. Well, I took the cross member out with the engine mounts still attached to it, so why not do the reverse, put the engine mounts, align them up onto the cross member, and then try to put the cross member back in place with that whole assembly. I'll save you a lot of time. Don't do it that way, and I'll show you why. So here I am. That's one of the Volvo mounts. I'm putting it into the place onto the cross member, and I had to finagle it several different ways thinking I'd do it. The biggest thing is that you'll notice there's a clip that fits into that bottom plate fits into a bracket on the U-shaped bracket. So basically torqued everything down, thought, oh, make sure it was all aligned. And now you can see, I'll talk about the heat shields in a minute here, but here I am thinking, okay, I've got the whole assembly ready to go. I found that the sway bar needed to be removed. I tried to avoid that, but it was another one I just had to do. Here I am trying to fit the cross member in place with the engine mounts. And it's a good thing I'm muting this, because after probably an hour of swearing and trying to get this in place, I just cried uncle and realized that's not the way to do it. So I took the engine mounts off of the cross member and proceeded to bolt them onto the crankcase of the engine. It's 4 bolts. I bolted them in place, applied the correct torque, and tried to set the bearing caps in place. It's one of those projects that just snowballs. So now that I've got the cross member out, I'm trying to put it back in place and trying to finagle it all around. I basically ruined what was already a delicate set of heat shields and the material on it. I'm a firm believer that if a Porsche engineer put something on the car, you need to put it back. There's a good reason. And this is one of those. Those heat shields, the exhaust manifolds come very close to the liquid-filled engine mounts. The last thing you want is the heat coming off of those exhaust manifolds, boiling the water inside the engine mount and causing premature failure. After doing this job, I never want to do it again on this car, and tried to come up with something as a retrofit for those heat shields. The problem was, it's clear to me that this is the mid-'80s, and Porsche was probably still using asbestos for those heat shields. I didn't even bother looking for whether Porsche still offers them. I went to a modern alternative. Sure enough, a quick check of Amazon found that Coolant Thermotech products offer a aluminized heat barrier that's adhesive back, and it withstands radiant heat up to 2,000 degrees. It's much thinner than the original material. So let me take you through the install. Here's a good shot of what's left of the driver's side heat shield. This one was actually in better shape than the passenger side. This one still had the foil backing, and you can see there's about 6 or 7 metal tabs that the factory used to hold this in place. So this side was still completely intact. I carefully removed what I could and used this for a template. Luckily, the other side, the shape of the other side is the mirror image of this, so I was able to use this one for a pattern on both sides. So here I am carefully trying to remove the tabs. And you can see that's the aluminized backing, and there's the insulation still adhesively mounted to the heat shield. So I wanted to use that as a first backer. Here I am tracing a pattern to cut out a replacement of my new Thermotech material, and you can see it's much thinner. With the shape in place, I took off the adhesive back, and that nicely adhered to the asbestos that's on the heat shield. So then I thought, okay, just as an extra caution, I had enough material. I cut out a second piece and then adhered that to the first piece to give a nice solid bond and perhaps a bit more degree of protection for those mounts. So that's the driver's side done. And then it was just a matter of flipping the cross member. And you can see the passenger side was already in sorry shape, and several of the tabs were gone. That's me confirming the pattern could be reversed from the old piece on the driver's side. Same process, other side. Put the first piece in, connected to the asbestos that's still adhered to it. Cut a second piece and then mount to that. And really, this was a half-hour exercise, but I think it will go a long way to ensuring that the engine mounts don't boil over on long drives. All right, here's a close-up shot of the finished product. I'm pleased with the results that no one will ever see. So now with the engine mounts bolted back to the engine crankcase and the heat shields repaired, it was time to put the crossmember back in place. The biggest thing you'll notice, keep an eye on how I'm jacking up and lowering the engine. The biggest learning was just how compressed the original engine mounts were. When I first started disassembling the car, I bought a pair of bar hoists from Harbor Freight to support the 600-pound engine from the top. Now, when I put that in and had the chains all strapped to it, I basically tightened it to the point where the engine was at that point. Now that I've put the new engine mounts in, the effective top to bottom dimension of the overall engine is now about almost an inch lower because the new Volvo engine mounts are not compressed like the old ones. What you have to do is, once you put the new engine mounts in, you have to account for that difference in height. So now that's what you're seeing me do here with the pole jack supporting the engine from underneath. There's a good shot of really cranking on that pole jack to push the engine up, and there is both engine mounts in place. So now I can put in the cross member, and here I am trying to finagle that with one arm. What's really holding up the cross member is the fact that it attaches to the front suspension wishbone. So I'll get to that later. But I'm putting the bottom plate of the engine mount and trying to fit the cross member and match up the hole to do that. There's a great shot of just how close the exhaust manifolds are to the engine mounts. So it's imperative that those heat shields are repaired if yours are in bad shape, and I think this will go a long way to protecting the engine mounts. So the most time-consuming part of this job is trying to get the engine lifted enough and get these parts in place that everything fits back together. So at first I tried to lift the engine up. You can see how dramatic it is. It's almost about an inch of travel. And then I realized I needed to support the cross member, and I just had to rely. My goal here was to get the cross member in place with the engine mounts and then worry about lifting the whole engine up. So that again, the pole jack came in handy that I could support the cross member. Now the pole jack's holding the cross member for me as a second pair of hands while I just basically get the engine mounts aligned. There's a good example. The engine mounts want to tilt out, and you have to use a crowbar to get the studs at the bottom of the engine mount into the cross member. Here I am using it, crowbar. That gets you can see me moving it, and now once I have that stud in place, I can put the lock nut. There's a huge flat washer, a lock nut, and the nut in place. So now in this shot, I've managed to bolt the engine mounts back to the cross member loosely, just enough that it holds itself and I can focus on getting the cross member tightened up. So now you see the pole jack is back underneath the oil pan, and I've gone ahead and just lifted it enough that I wanted to put 2 key bolts back into the cross member, and that's what this close-up is going to show. There's 2 bolts that hold the cross member to frame-mounted brackets, and once those are in, that's a key component that's really holding the cross member in place and thus the engine from falling down. So here I am just showing me putting in the passenger side bolt, again lifting up the engine enough that I can match those holes, and then using a punch pin and a soft blow hammer to get the the bolt back in place. This is the passenger side, and just behind my socket wrench is the air conditioning compressor for reference. If you didn't notice it before, on the Porsche 928, that engine cross member is actually a key component of the front suspension. Rear bushings of the front suspension wishbones are held in place by that cross member. So at this point, the cross member is being held in place with 4 key bolts. The 2 long bolts that fit through the frame brackets, and then another set that are actually hidden when the steering rack's in place that mount to the car's subframe. In order to get the front suspension wishbones back into the front of the cross member, I needed to use the pole jack again to support the weight of that. I was able to grab the arm where the tie rod connects to and move the wheel, literally caster camber, in order to move the suspension enough to get the bolts to line up for the bearing caps. So here I am. I've got the pole jack holding up the bottom wishbone, and it's putting on enough weight that here I am tightening up the bearing caps for the front of the wishbone while it's supported by the pole jack. Now with that one in place, I moved to the back side, slightly adjusted the pole jack, lifted up the wishbone into the cross member. There's a good shot of the orange wheel chock. I basically could move the wheel fore and aft, turn it a little bit to get enough weight or get the wheel in position that I could line up the bolts. I've sped this up to about 4 times, so what you're seeing probably took a half an hour. Important point here is I'm just hand tightening up with the socket, as once the car suspension, once I remove you'll see it right by my right hand is the jack stand. Once I remove that and the front wheels support the weight, I'll loosen these up and retighten them again. See me moving the wheel around there. There's a good reference point. It's very easy to move it without the wheel connected. And again, it's getting the pole jack in position so that it can support the weight of the wishbone. Holding it up, moving the wheel, chocking it, getting it just right. Putting the toe bracket underneath the front bearing cap and putting all of those bolts in place into the bushing of the wishbone. Matter just getting everything lined up and then putting the 4 bolts in to hold those in. So now that all of the suspension components are back in place, you saw me just tighten it down with a socket wrench, but I didn't torque anything down. What I will do is once I take the jack stands out, the weight of the car will be supported by the front wheels. I'll loosen and retighten those bolts I just tightened up again. Now you may be thinking to yourself, and you are right, all of these changes with the steering rack removed combined with the cross member out means this car is going to need a 4-wheel alignment. Porsche dealership is only a couple miles away, so while the car still has its old set of tires on, I'll plan to drive it over there, have them do an alignment on this car, because this car just doesn't seem like it would be a candidate for a typical place to get it done. So hopefully, I'm hoping Flemington Porsche is up to the task, and we'll get the car aligned, and then I'll be comfortable putting new tires on the car. Before that happens, the next video is going to focus on putting the steering rack and new lower ball joints in. I'll be providing that as soon as I get that posted in the coming week. Then after that, it's spending a lot of time underneath this car. I realized that in addition to the oil pan gasket, another culprit of fluid leaks is the power steering pump and perhaps the hoses attached to it. That will be an upcoming project in my quest to make this car leak-free. Anyway, that's a topic for a different day. Hopefully you found this video very informative, and you know what you're up against if you go to replace the oil pan gasket as well as change the engine mounts on your Porsche 928. If you like this video, please press the like button. And if you haven't done so, please press the subscribe button as I put up a variety of content in addition to just our project car here. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, and we'll see you soon. Take care.